Hello and welcome to this keynote discussion. I'm Mike Ward and I'm the head of Global Thought Leadership at DRG, part of Clarivate, which is a global leader providing trusted information and insights to accelerate the pace of innovation across the whole of the life sciences healthcare spectrum. I'm delighted to be joined by Peter Kolchinsky, who is a founder and managing partner at RA Capital Management, which is currently the most active investor in the life science companies, providing both seed funding to startups, as well as sort of lead private, IPO, follow-on financings for its portfolio companies. It works across the whole of the life sciences spectrum, whether it's developing drugs, medical devices, diagnostics, or research tools, from idea inception all the way through to commercialization. So I'm now going to invite Peter to share some of his thoughts about how he sees sort of the industry and the challenges it's going to have beyond the pandemic. So Peter, thanks very much for joining me, and I'm going to pass the baton over to you.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that intro, Mike. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and talk about really what might we learn from COVID, that might inform how we think about the future of our industry, looking out beyond the pandemic. And I thought I would find a way to weave in three subjects into one pretty short talk. Just keep things interesting. I'm not going to use slides for this. They can sometimes be a little distracting. So our team spent a fair bit of time thinking about, all right, so we're going to get some vaccines to end the pandemic, right? You've got the adenoviral vaccines like AstraZeneca with the University of Oxford. You've got the mRNA vaccines, Moderna, BioNTech, and Pfizer, and a number of others. You've got protein-based vaccines like Novavax's, and behind them Sanofi, right? And so far, they seem to be generating neutralizing antibodies. We're waiting for the results of the first protective studies. We'll see if the first of them, the AstraZeneca one, is good enough. It's certainly got the weakest of the neutralizing antibody data, but if it is good enough, then certainly all the other ones behind that, elicit a stronger response. And there's really good reason to hope that when those vaccines are all available at a large enough scale, that enough people will get vaccinated that the pandemic will be declared over, and we can go back to to sort of normal, right? Seeing each other, being with family. I actually really like these Zoom meetings. I'm way more productive. I don't think I'm going to go back to doing a ton of in-office meetings. And God knows I hate traveling on airplanes to board meetings all over the place. So, I have learned that from COVID. But in terms of vaccines, is that it for COVID? Like, are we just going to have to vaccinate once, or might we have a need for the long run? And so this is what we really spent some time thinking about. And, I would probably say that if the entire world could be as efficient at controlling the pandemic and deploying vaccines widely, and then giving even booster shots if needed in areas where it seems to still be flaring up, maybe it might be possible to eradicate a virus like this, but we just don't see that. There's an independent streak in some parts of the world, like America, South America, where people just don't want to be told what to do. They don't, believe in public health. In some cases, and they will, continue to be reservoirs of the virus. Now maybe everybody gets infected once and they're immune and that's it. But we, have heard about a recent case of a true reinfection. So what if this virus is with us for the long run? What if it's just going to be, endemic? We already have 4 cold coronaviruses. They're mild, not that big a deal. Unless, of course, you're older and have respiratory issues. And we think that there's a reasonable chance that it's going to be prudent to incorporate a COVID vaccine with our annual flu shots, right? So we concluded that if there's a reasonable probability of that, then it's not enough to simply look at which technologies are going to give us a COVID vaccine that ends the pandemic. We should look ahead and ask, what are the platform technologies that allow creation of a pentavalent flu plus COVID vaccine? I say pentavalent because all modern flu vaccines have components that protect us against 4 flu strains. And so adding one more antigen for COVID, that would be 5. So a pentavalent vaccine. And what you realize is if you're going to be giving repeat shots, annually or whatever of a pentavalent vaccine, then it can't be adenoviral based because you can't really redose adenoviral vaccine vectors. We develop immunity against them, right? Against the viral vector itself. So we cross that off the list. And then when you look at the mRNAs, they're particularly painful. Now, a lot of the people report mild pain, but there's some fraction that reports severe pain. They can cause systemic fever. And that's when you give just enough of the mRNA to protect against COVID. As soon as you have to give 5 times more to protect against COVID and 4 flu strains, you're getting up into doses of mRNA that are quite difficult to tolerate, and likely to be extremely painful. Part of that seems to be that mRNA is its own adjuvant, right? As opposed to protein-based vaccines where you've got the antigen, but it's not itself painful or problematic, and then you can control how much adjuvant you want to give. So it may be that the mRNA companies are going to figure out how to reduce the reactogenicity, the painfulness of that platform, but that's going to take time. And we haven't seen any credible, quadrivalent flu mRNA programs. They've mostly been focused on other diseases, with their technology. So for them to create a whole pentavalent flu vaccine with mRNA that you're going to give year after year and that we're not going to be scared to take. I mean, imagine sending your kid in to take something that's way more painful than the flu shot, way more painful even than Shingrix, the shingles vaccine, which is the most painful commercially available vaccine out there, right? So, there's a long way to go with mRNA. I think that technology makes a ton of sense to have at the ready at large scale for any future pandemic. It clearly leads to a very rapid response to a pandemic, and it makes sense to have that capacity at the ready. But I think that the technologies that are going to get us to a pentavalent vaccine that we can redose, every year are actually the much more traditional ones. Traditional one we think is going to win out in the end. So whether it's Novavax or Sanofi, they're the ones that can simply add one more, protein antigen to their flu vaccine. And as long as they have the same adjuvant system, they can readily combine it. Now, when you further, parse it to see who has that, you realize that Sanofi's working on a COVID vaccine that has a different adjuvant than the one that is in their flu vaccine. So, they'll have to think longer term beyond the pandemic and realize, we should be integrating, our flu and COVID programs on the same adjuvant platform. Novavax actually has that. We're investors in Novavax in part for that reason, that they can create a pentavalent vaccine. And there's a company in Australia that has it. After all of our analysis, we actually found another company that has it. We have no idea whether they realize that they can do this. We think everybody right now has their blinders on, is just focused on the pandemic response. But one day we hope they'll wake up and realize, oh, wait, we can actually serve the market need beyond. Now, I don't know how much money there is, in the initial pandemic response. You see the world's reaction to these vaccines, and some people say they're worth a lot and we should pay a lot. Others say, you're saving the world, you should do this, for very little money and be a patriot. But what I can tell you is that the long-term market for a pentavalent vaccine is likely to be much larger than the current flu market. Current global flu market is $4.5 billion a year. If you were to add one more COVID component and it, priced it a little bit higher, you could see that being maybe $5.5 billion a year. And then I hope that the world takes vaccination much more seriously, because in the future, when somebody sneezes or coughs, you're not going to think flu anymore. You're going to think, oh no, is this COVID? And so if we were to see the vaccination rates globally go up 2 or 3-fold, even in a country like the US, only 45% of people get vaccinated every year, and the US is a big part of the global flu market. The whole rest of the world really needs to get on board with, flu vaccinations. when there's a COVID component in there, maybe they'll take it more seriously. So maybe that 5.5 billion becomes more like 10 or 15 billion. Now that is plenty of incentive to get companies like Novavax and Sanofi and others to develop that pentavalent vaccine. And then let's hope they add other components. There's still RSV out there. There's other respiratory viruses. So let's really expand the respiratory panel vaccines to go well beyond flu and help us, really make the whole world healthier. So that's one example of looking beyond the initial pandemic, just in the vaccine space. But what about also preparing for future pandemic outbreaks? If they're going to be viruses like SARS-2, coronaviruses, and so far we've seen SARS-1 and MERS, then it's very difficult to anticipate these viruses and create vaccines for them. Having large mRNA facilities at the ready to quickly, fire up, vaccines for that would be great. I think that realistically, the mRNA vaccines, even if they were at full capacity right now, you're talking about a response time from when you first have the sequence of about like 10 months, to test the vaccine and get it done. Maybe in the future it could be faster, but that's a long time for the global economy to be shut down. But consider that we had a drug like remdesivir that was developed for Ebola, and it wasn't even very good. I mean, it barely had any effect on Ebola. Turned out by chance to have a little bit of efficacy on SARS-2. Well, when you really study the virus's internal workings, what you see is that the polymerase, the replicase, the protease, they're conserved enough that you could develop molecules that are specific for coronaviruses that you could take off the shelf. And the moment you see an outbreak, you can start treating people, right? Now, is it going to reduce their infectivity? Don't know. Maybe not. It'll hopefully save their lives. And you're still going to want to contain the outbreak rather than simply try to treat everybody, right? Like there's a finite amount of drug. But stockpiling millions of doses of such drugs around the world would certainly help to keep us from reacting, from panicking the way that we did and shutting down our global economy, right? So think of the trillions of dollars that we have lost, on the scale of months because of how much this virus scared us, right? We retreated from the world. So what is the value of a stockpile of drugs that would make us feel safe enough that even when you hear that there's a pandemic or an outbreak somewhere, you don't necessarily go into lockdown. You simply go into, all right, let's be vigilant. If we detect symptoms, we get tested, we do some contact tracing, we give drug to the people around that person. And that's how we, contain, mortality until there's a vaccine that, really puts the virus to rest, right? So I mentioned contact tracing in there. We're going to need better tests, right? So right now it's still incredibly difficult to get a rapid answer as to, am I infected? But in the future, it would be great if we, could have a whole bunch of both masks and, rapid tests delivered to our homes, businesses, and you could routinely test anybody that, seems to have any symptoms at all, quickly, get them access to the drugs. Remember the way that people rushed out to get prescriptions of hydroxychloroquine when they thought that it worked, right? So if drugs were that widely available and everybody could have, a bottle of some sort of coronavirus cocktail, inhibitor cocktail, it would have to be pretty safe. That would go a long ways towards preparing the world. So something to think about for the longer run. We've got, some projects in the works looking at that. I'm pretty sure others do. So that's sort of the first part of what I wanted to share with everybody. Now, one of the things that I took away from the world's response to COVID is, wow, how rapidly we can mobilize to fire up a ton of clinical trials, right? I mean, you suddenly see, our industry pivot to this problem and the whole world is watching, and all of a sudden they see, just how much vibrant creativity there is in our industry. And the thing is that amount of activity I see for breast cancer, for Alzheimer's, right? I'm going to flip, if I believe I can do this, choose my virtual background. So as my background here, I'm showing you a map that we have of COVID vaccines. So if you go on our, and actually drugs, you can go on the RA Capital website, racap.com. You'll see the COVID link, and we've got these maps in full high resolution display for COVID vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And all this tiny little print along the sides here, each one of those is a different drug program. And we have maps like this of just about every therapeutic area out there. We see the creativity of the industry, and the world just saw it. Now they typically see it as lists. There's plenty of websites that show you lists of programs. We just happen to use mind maps. But here's the thing that surprised us, and in retrospect, it shouldn't have surprised us. There were so many trials that all of a sudden their progress, instead of us getting results every few weeks from a controlled trial telling us what worked and what didn't work, progress slowed down. All of a sudden, you can't enroll enough patients into trials. They're being basically, instead of rapidly getting answers for a drug of a certain cytokine class, or getting answers rapidly for an oral polymerase inhibitor. Instead, you're trying to get answers for 5 of them, and it's taking forever, and you can't even learn from the results of one. Remdesivir was able to get data quickly, but soon as remdesivir is approved, it immediately slows down the development of all the drugs behind it, because now it's used, it's standard of care for certain patients, and you can't, get patients off of that. And there's a solution to that, and we see it. It's the ISPY trial. It's the WHO master protocol. A coordinated attempt to learn about what works and what doesn't, mechanistically, what works and what doesn't, which modalities, might be better than others. It requires that we collaborate, even though we're competitors, right? Well, COVID brought that out. Right? We all saw the importance of not being the kind of company that just hoards your data. If you see a promising signal, you've got to let the world know so that anybody else who might be able to use that knowledge can also react. It's the reason why we published our map to the world, even though it contained our due diligence and our insights that inform our investment decisions. I mean, in theory, others might have been able to act on it and make investment decisions that we would have liked to make. But we felt it important to balance, our need to keep our intellectual property proprietary with the need to equip the world with knowledge. Well, the industry has that similar reaction across the board. We see data sharing, taking place across the industry. We need more of that in other disease areas, because I would argue that breast cancer, it is, to somebody who gets that diagnosis, it's their own personal COVID. Diabetes is COVID to the people who have that diagnosis. And if we look at it that way, we might consider creating master protocols and thinking about how you don't quite submit your drug. You think about submitting your drug to the FDA for approval. Well, imagine if you submitted your phase 1 tested drug to a master protocol for review and inclusion. And now that master protocol has a placebo arm, but it's a placebo arm that helps inform 5, 6, 7 other arms that have drugs in it. And of course, a lot of those drugs aren't going to work. And so they contribute to our, body of knowledge about, how effectively the controls work. A drug that doesn't work better than placebo, you can pretty much blend those results in with your control arm, and now you've got a much tighter confidence interval around the control results. And when a drug does seem to work, it stands out from the pack, but it's not enough that it works better than placebo. The question is, does it work better than the other drugs that are there? And so you start to see that, okay, there's multiple IL-6 antibodies in development for anti-IL-6 antibodies in development for COVID. And, some fail, some seem to work, but the question is, which works best, right? That's what we really want to know. It doesn't do us any good to launch uh, three versions of the same type of mechanism, because they're all better than placebo, and then to really have two of them be inferior and fail commercially. That is an expensive way to fail, right? The most expensive way to fail. And it's the waste of that money because we're competing, in ways that maybe we shouldn't be competing, that drives up how much our industry has to collect in revenues in order to keep it all going. So I know it's a tall order, and somebody's going to say, but I could have made a lot of money in the near term. My stock could have gone up, even if 5 years from now, this drug would turn out to be not best in class and it would have failed. And it's true, there are going to be people that cynically just want to stay out of it and, allow their drug to look better than placebo rather than, be revealed to be worse than other drugs. But there are ways for us to get together and change the rules that, for example, require that drugs be included in a master protocol. I haven't thought through whether, that's going to have terrible unintended consequences, but I think we should have that brainstorm. And it's going to be, people like me, my peers, who make investment decisions that, are going to need to sit at that table together with the people that are actually running these trials, that are developing drugs and would be the ones to have to submit their drugs to these trials, to figure out, can this be done? If it can be done, we can do drug development much faster, much more efficiently. BioCentury has actually written up in recent issues, the need for this kind of thing. They're absolutely right. If you look on the RA Capital website, you'll find a paper I wrote 8 years ago calling for what we call solution development and multiplex trials. That's basically master protocol. It means define yourself by the problem you aim to solve, not by the drug you are trying to develop, right? It means we would have had hepatitis C master protocols with multiple drugs in there. And when one works for one mechanism, even if not very well, and another works for another mechanism, your next thought is, why don't we combine them? And indeed, that's exactly what you would do, right? You had a COVID master protocol and you saw that a polymerase inhibitor worked well. You immediately incorporate that into all the other arms, and all the other drugs are now tested on top of that. So I hope that this interest in these more elaborate master protocol trials continues beyond COVID. I'll confess, I worry that it won't. And I've got one other topic to share, but Mike, I should give you the moderator prerogative to ask some follow-up questions and before I take us in another direction.
Yeah, so we've got about 10 minutes left. So I mean, it's interesting, how you sort of had a look at the technical challenges around the pandemic, and clearly you've highlighted a number of those, particularly in sort of the vaccine space. But it's interesting that to move forward and to think almost in a sort of post-pandemic world actually requires socio-political and socio-economic changes. It's almost as though we have to get people to sort of change the behaviors. And you mentioned vaccine uptake is not necessarily that great in even in the developed world. There are places where it's actually now falling off. So when you're thinking about the technical challenges and looking for those solutions, and where to put your money to work, how are you you're managing those behavioral science risks, and what can we do to?
I'll tell you that the greatest behavioral risk that we have right now facing our industry is the way that lawmakers in America misunderstand the value of biomedical innovation and how to achieve affordability for patients. That one misunderstanding, the fact that some of them don't understand how a portfolio works, they would say, look, we're only proposing that we cut the high profits of the 250 most successful drugs down to simply being reasonably profitable. Since they're reasonably profitable, they would justify their investment, they would still get developed. And you scratch your head and you think like, oh my God, those are the 250 drugs that make the entire portfolio of the industry worth pursuing, right? I mean, it's like if I were to take somebody's stock portfolio and I would say, look, you've got 50 stocks here, and I'm just going to go after the 5 best performing ones and cut them down, by a lot. You'll be fine, right? It's like, no, like those 5 stocks are the ones that make my portfolio work. If I knew that, I had to risk, my money on 50, different drug programs just to find out which are going to be the great ones, and then afterwards, when the government can see which are the best ones, they'll, take away the jackpot from just those, the whole portfolio doesn't work. That's self-evident to you, to me, I pray to absolutely everybody listening to this. But it is not self-evident to people who have spent their careers in the government and maybe don't even have a stock portfolio of their own. They've got nothing to relate to. They don't understand, right? And I've had this conversation with somebody who drafted HR3, and it was really disheartening to realize what a wide gulf there is in just our basic understanding of economics. Here's another thing that many in our industry actually don't know about, the value of our products. And that is a shame. And I think we all should, sort of take our own course, to really understand what it is that we do and why it's so valuable to the world. Unlike anything else in healthcare, which doesn't go generic, drugs go generic. What that means is everything that society spends its money on, except for drugs, all hospitals, doctors, it's a rent, right? And if it's a rent, it means it's an expense. However, drugs go generic, which means that what we spend on branded drugs is kind of like a mortgage investment. You are paying for a house that you will then pay off, right? You're dangling a reward before a builder, and you say, if you build me this, I will pay you a mortgage for 10 to 15 years, and then I will pay off the mortgage, and I will have your invention, what you've built, as a public good, an inexpensive generic that will keep serving society for the rest of all time. If you think about the fact that Decadron was once, a branded drug, and then it went generic, and it's now called dexamethasone, and look, it turns out to shelter us from COVID, right? It has that utility. Well, nobody thinks about, spending on branded drugs as a mortgage investment, right? And I say investment. Everything else is an expense. This is an investment. And I wrote a book, The Great American Drug Deal, that I really think everybody in our industry should read so that we all can represent the value of what we do, clearly to our own family members, to our friends, to everybody that sort of thinks we're good people, but then basically think we're maybe not such good people because they look at drug prices and say anybody who charges that much for these drugs must be a bad person. So they're conflicted. They don't understand how it is we could be good people if drugs are so unaffordable. Well, when we're investing as a society in something good, we should be investing collectively, which means we should be paying premiums and taxes for proper insurance, and insurance should be making branded drugs as well as generics affordable to all patients. When we don't have proper insurance, when you pay, let's say, only 80% of drugs, the cost of drugs from insurance, and 20% in co-payments, then what you're basically doing is making all the people who are unfortunate enough to be sick now in the next 10 to 15 years shoulder the burden of creating a public good that will reassure us for the rest of all time, that will mitigate that disease for the rest of all time. I'll leave you this one analogy. Imagine that a town needs a fire department and it decides it's going to take out a mortgage for that fire department to have it built. And it pays for 80% of that mortgage from town taxes. But 20%, it tells the fire department, you're going to have to pay 20% of that mortgage over the next 15 years by charging co-payments to people whose homes catch fire. And so they do. A home catches fire, they rush to the scene, they demand a copayment. Some people have it, and so they put the fire out. Some people don't have it, so they let the house burn. And after 15 years, the mortgage is paid off. And now the fire department is inexpensive. Nobody charges co-payments anymore, and everybody's house is put out. Well, what you've just done is essentially terrorize the people whose homes caught fire in the first 10 to 15 years in order to secure a resource that serves that community for the rest of time. Why? That's not how we fund a fire department. We fund it from, collective taxes. 100% of that mortgage is paid for, out of the town's taxes, not 80%. Now, of course, people will say, but you need out-of-pocket costs to deter inappropriate utilization. Really, doctors decide whether patients need our products. We don't need to deputize them into second-guessing their doctors. So we have launched, and I say, there's others involved in this, a nonprofit called No Patient Left Behind. I invite anybody to come take a look at it, nopatientleftbehind.org. And we propose reforms that are rooted in the idea that we all have to solve affordability for patients by advocating for proper insurance, low out-of-pocket costs, no out-of-pocket costs even. And at the same time, we have to ensure that society gets value for all that it pays for branded drugs by having all drugs go generic without undue delay. Now, a lot of the people listening to this are probably working on gene therapies or cell therapies or complex biologics that cannot naturally go generic. You just can't copy them. It's not about patents. They're just uncopyable. And one of the things that means is in order to continue to offer society that unique value of being builders rather than landlords, builders who are happy to collect a finite mortgage rather than landlords who extract rent, we have to agree to a reform that I call contractual genericization, which is actually not that different from a BARDA contract that just says that after that initial reward period, 10 to 15 years, even if there's no competition for your drug that can genericize it through the conventional competitive means, you will agree to have your drug go under contract and make it at a low but still profitable price as if it were a generic. So you'll hear more about that reform. Certainly, if you read my book, you'll hear about it. If you go to the nopatientleftbehind.org website, you'll hear about it. And this is the conversation we're now having with lawmakers. We've got a frenzied week where we're meeting with members of what I call the life science builders. These are the supporters of the No Patient Left Behind initiative. We're all meeting with various lawmakers in order to go through detailed slides explaining this in the hopes that we can vaccinate the next American Congress against thinking that HR 3 is a good idea, that price controls are a good idea. They should control the back end of the NPV curve, not the entire NPV curve. They need to leave mortgages intact. That's an example of attempting to change the socio-political framework that we all operate in. And I would invite everybody listening to step up and be a leader in that movement, right? It's critical. It's not enough that you just focus on developing drugs.
So that's an excellent call to arms, which I hope the audience is going to heed. And although it might sort of look like I'm sort of trying to be a chat show host and giving you the opportunity to plug your book and
no, I took that opportunity myself. No worries.
So well done for that. I'm sure other books are available. But what you provided us there, Peter, is absolutely fantastic food for thought. And unfortunately, we run out of time because there's lots and lots of other things.
You guys have a great conference. I hope that you enjoy it. I'll leave you with just one comment. The schism in our industry is not between biotech and pharma. We are all now biotech. The schism in our industry is between the builders and the landlords. And we all have to be builders, proud to get our reward as a finite mortgage and have to keep innovating to replace lost revenues, due to genericization.
Yeah, and we've got the foundations, so yeah, we can do that. Thanks very much, Peter.
Thank you. Take care.